I was watching a video on YouTube the other day, and it was a tiny house tour on the Living Big in a Tiny House channel, which is awesome, and Bryce does amazing videos. And it was a mom who had built a tiny house for her and her son. She had a composting toilet, but other than that, she was on grid, and there was a criticism in the comments about how she wasn't really a minimalist because she had too many things in her tiny house. And then there was another comment that said she spent all that money and she didn't even have a flushing toilet. So sort of two ends of a spectrum. And I kind of wanted to make a video to comment on that preconceived notions about who lives in a tiny house and what you have to be in order to live in a tiny house. So the biggest thing that people think if you're going to live in a tiny house is that somehow everybody who lives in a tiny house has to be a minimalist. You have to only own 33 things or whatever it is, whatever the rule is, in order to actually get your minimalist card for your wallet. And I'm here to tell you that that is just a bunch of bullshit, because tiny houses aren't necessarily for people who are minimalists. There are as many different types of people living in tiny houses as there are designs for tiny houses. There's this sort of preconceived notion of what you have to be to live in a tiny house, and that's just ridiculous. You've seen my tour. You know that while my space is small, I still have a lot of stuff because I am what I call a minimalist in training. Which means that I'm always trying to get rid of shit, but I don't always succeed, and I still want to have some things that bring me joy. So I'm not a true minimalist. I didn't move into a tiny house because I was a minimalist. I moved into a tiny house because I wanted to save money. I no longer wanted to have condo fees and property taxes and huge mortgage payments. I wanted to save money so that I could perhaps travel more and or retire earlier, maybe go back to school. I don't know, but I wanted to give myself flexibility. And going tiny was something that I felt would give me more options. Another reason that people go tiny, and was also in my mind, was having a smaller footprint. Someday I hope to move to the island and be fully off-grid with solar panels and a compost toilet. Maybe I will put in a septic field a system. I'm not sure. It gives you the ability to have a smaller footprint in that your space is smaller. A lot of people who build tiny houses want to have the flexibility of moving their tiny house and not being tied to owning land and having to sell something in order to move. When you have a tiny house on wheels, you just hook up and move it. So another reason people go tiny is because they want to have flexibility of where they live, and they want to be able to take their homes with them. There's lots of reasons to go tiny that don't involve being a minimalist. You don't always want to be a total off-grid pioneer type either. There's nothing wrong with having a tiny house and wanting to have it fully hooked up to utilities. There's no rule that says in order to live in a tiny house, you have to have solar panels, a compost toilet, and be catching your rainwater. You can if you want, and that's awesome for the environment. But if you don't want to, that's okay too. So there's criticisms. It doesn't really matter what you do. You're either have too much stuff, or you don't have enough and there's no way you can live like that. You either have a compost toilet, or if you have a flush toilet, somehow you're not living up to your potential about living in a tiny house because you're still hooked up to the grid. You don't build a tiny house to make somebody else happy. You build it for your needs, which brings me to size. You know, they say size doesn't matter. Well, apparently when it comes to tiny houses, it does matter, because people have very strong opinions about what size a tiny house should be. My tiny house is just under 400 square feet if I count the loft above the kitchen here, just under 300 if I don't. It's not a small tiny house. She's 37 feet long, including the gooseneck, and I went 9.5 feet wide so that I could have extra space inside because it's my full-time house. People somehow think that tiny houses should be under 100 square feet, under 200 square feet. They shouldn't be any wider than 8 feet wide or 8.5 feet wide. It's as if there's a competition to see how small you can get in living in a tiny house. And if you build a bigger size tiny house, you're not really a tiny house liver. Again, says who? Please, somebody show me the rule book that says you cannot live in a tiny house if it's over 200 square feet or 300 square feet. It's your house. Whether it's on a foundation or it's on a custom built trailer, you're building a home. So you build what you want to build. But people will have an opinion about it. They'll say, well, that's not really a tiny house, is it? Because, it's pretty big. People will have an opinion whether it's too big, and they'll then have criticisms if it's too small. Again, says who? The opinion out there that you have to fit into a certain set of parameters in order to really be living in a tiny house is ridiculous. If you are a uber minimalist and you literally only have 33 things in your wardrobe and you want to use a bucket and sawdust for your toilet, whether they be on trailers, vans, on foundations, I think that's amazing. But it doesn't mean one is more right than the other. It just means they're different. And we should celebrate that, because what we're doing here is exploring alternate ways of living and interacting with the environment that we're in. We are not, or at least I am not out to prove a point to anybody that I'm more tiny housey than you are. This is my home and I absolutely love it. But she's not tiny compared to some tiny houses. But she's tiny compared to conventional foundation built houses. Another thing that people will criticize is the cost of your tiny house. Somehow people get offended that you spend over a certain amount to build your tiny house. Not that it's anybody's business what you spend on your tiny house. There's a lot of videos out there, and they're almost always from the US or other countries, quite often self-built. You hear numbers like somebody built their house for $20,000 or $50,000. And then when they find out that I spent the amount I did to build my tiny house, you could have built a regular house for that amount. First of all, for the amount I built my tiny house, you can barely build a garage in Calgary. That's one. Two, I had it professionally built by a builder who builds to code and is CSA certified, which means that that was an expense that builder went through to get certified, which was valuable to me. I used all new materials. I went wider and longer. I used a gooseneck trailer. Those things all cost money. All of my cabinets are custom cabinetry. I didn't want to skimp on the things that mattered to me because this is my home, not a vacation property. You see these videos about what it costs to build a tiny house somewhere else, and you're not comparing apples to apples. The Canadian dollar and the US dollar, big difference. If you were going to spend $70,000 in the US, you're probably going to be closer to 95,000 Canadian. They're often self-built, so they're not factoring in what the cost would be for labor. And three, they're different sizes. Almost always those houses are quite a bit smaller. There's no competition, or at least there shouldn't be a competition. It doesn't matter what size it is. It doesn't matter how much stuff you have. It doesn't matter what kind of appliances you have in there, or if you're on grid or off grid. It doesn't matter what it costs. It is your house. We should be supporting each other. That's what I wanted to say in today's video. There's no such thing as a typical tiny house dweller. We're all different. Some of us are minimalists, some of us are maximalists, and some of us are minimalists in training, like me.